Okay, well, I started up to restart the session, and so it looks like we're back. So hopefully everyone will join us so we can carry on as we were doing before. I don't know. That is very strange. It's never happened to me in all the years that I've been using Zoom. That's never happened before. So we will see. But so it looks like what we'll have then is we're going to have two different recordings. So we'll have the recording from the first one, and we'll have the recording from this session. But what I'll do is I'll go ahead and I'll finish up just the material we had for tonight, and then hopefully other people will join us along the way, and then we'll have the recording. They can then watch the recording later. So very strange, but I don't know why that happened. But let's go ahead and share out again, and hopefully others will figure out to come along and join us along the way. So, okay, okay. All right, let's see if there we go. Okay, well, we'll soldier on and hopefully people will come along as we're finishing up here. So that's Vroom's expectancy theory. Again, it's more of a process-oriented type of theory whereby employees are going to look at here, the likelihood that my level of performance will result in my effort will result in a level of performance. Here's the likelihood that I will get an outcome given to me, some type of reward given to me by achieving that level of performance. And then here is the value that I place upon that outcome. And so leaders need to know their employees' expectancy. They need to know their confidence in their ability to do the job. They need to know what types of outcomes those employees value. So they provide incentives to employees that those employees value. And then they also need to carry through on their promises, what's called instrumentality, and make sure that they actually provide the things that they are promising to provide to their employees. So that's Vroom's expectancy theory. Then a second theory is Skinner's operant conditioning. And if you have done any work in psychology, you're familiar with B.F. Skinner and his idea of operant conditioning. Operant conditioning says that people react to stimuli. And so they will react to consequences, both positive as well as negative consequences. And if we provide the right set of positive and negative consequences, we can then shape people's behavior. And operant conditioning says it's these consequences and how often we provide these consequences that will shape the behavior of our employees. Now, the way in which operant conditioning works is that you can provide positive reinforcement or you can provide negative reinforcement, punishment. What we have found is that positive reinforcement usually is the most efficient means of influencing behavior. Punishment tends to be much less efficient and much less effective at shaping an employee's behavior. How we provide that positive reinforcement will have an impact upon how quickly people adopt new behaviors and then how long those behaviors will persist, how long those behaviors will hang around. And what we have found is that an intermittent reinforcement schedule where positive reinforcement is provided at highly variable levels in that there's not a predictable provision of positive reinforcement. The positive reinforcement is provided at different intervals and unpredicted intervals. That's what then allows for the behaviors to become more permanent. It may take longer for those employees to acquire those behaviors, but once they've acquired those behaviors then last much longer and they're much more permanent than if you use a more predictable schedule of providing that positive reinforcement. But positive reinforcement is going to harden those behaviors much better than if we use negative reinforcement. But it's all about consequences. And so for managers, you need to know the right reinforcements to provide, again, that employees place a value upon, and then provide them in a relatively unpredictable type of sequence. And that's what will help freeze those new behaviors on the part of employees. That's what's known as operant conditioning, B.F. Skinner. So again, kind of that psychological approach to how we can motivate employees. Then another theory for motivation is Bandura's social learning theory. So it reflects somewhat part of Skinner's operant conditioning, but it looks more at the cognitive process internal to employees. And it looks at how behavior can be shaped by the learning process that employees go through. And this is a very social type of aspect where we assume that people are interacting with other people in the organization. They're watching leaders, they are watching their supervisors. And so by watching their supervisors, by watching their colleagues, they will internalize those people's behavior, and that will then shape their behavior in turn. So they will model the behavior of others. They will live vicariously through the experiences that they see others experiencing. That they will, mentally rehearse things in their mind. Sometimes we have to give a presentation. We will rehearse that over and over in our mind before we give the presentation. That's a learning process. That's a way that we, in a very cognitive way, shape the behavior that we will then exhibit when we go in there to give that presentation. They will set goals for themselves, and those goals will then help them manage their behaviors throughout their time in their position. So social learning theory basically says that people, as part of a social unit, will learn from others, and they will internalize behaviors of others. And so what managers can do is they can motivate their employees by signaling what is important to that manager, what is important to the organization. And then by signaling what is important, by rewarding what is important, employees will learn that these are the types of behaviors that are valued by the manager. These are the types of behaviors that are valued by the organization and by their fellow employees. And then a fourth process-oriented theory is goal-setting theory from Edwin Locke. And this gets back to our discussion a few weeks ago about organizational goals and the influence that goals can have upon the behavior of employees and upon the effectiveness of the organization. And again, just to kind of do this very quickly, just in case our session ends again, Edwin Locke argues that difficult to achieve goals tend to be stronger motivators than easier to achieve goals or no goals at all. So it's kind of this interesting situation where difficult goals can end up being frustrating, but difficult goals can push people to achieve higher levels of achievement and higher levels of productivity than if it's a very easy to achieve goal. You think about something like field theory. Now, I don't know if you've run into field theory before. It's one of my favorite theories, but field theory argues that people operate within a field of influences. And one of those aspects of the field of influence is a tension that is created with unaccomplished tasks. So if you have a task that you have not yet accomplished, it creates tension where you are then pushed toward trying to achieve that goal and trying to accomplish that task, which motivates you to work harder to try and achieve that goal or that task. That type of tension is what we're talking about here with difficult goals. So the more difficult the goal, the more tension is created. The more tension is created, the more likely it is that people are going to work harder to try and achieve those more difficult goals. We know that goals are important for employee behavior, and they affect employee behavior by directing the attention of the employee on what they need to be focusing on. It intensifies their work effort. It intensifies persistence in continuing to work toward achieving that goal or doing that job. It also tends to spark creativity and problem solving and makes our employees more creative and innovative in the way in which they deal with problems in the organization. So the assignment of these difficult goals enhances performance and really does help motivate our employees to achieve higher levels of productivity and higher levels of performance. We know how to establish goals. We've talked about that in the previous class, but we know we need management support for those goals. We know it's good to have multiple ways of measuring those goals, both qualitative as well as quantitative ways of measuring our goals. We know it's important that we assign responsibility for the achievement of goals. We create these work groups that are then held accountable and responsible for the achievement of those goals. We know that we need effective leadership in order to engage in goal setting. We know we have to have a feedback loop in our goal setting process so that we can feed our experience of achieving our goals back into the redesign and the reformatting of those goals. We know that we have to strive for goal commitment and goal congruence, where employees and management share the same goals that benefit the organization. And we also know that we need to limit the goals that we are trying to achieve. Goal overload could really end up with a lot of conflict between our goals. Having a great multiplicity of goals can make it difficult to achieve those goals as an organization. But all those same things that we learned when we talked about goal setting and its impact upon effectiveness. So essentially, when we're talking about motivating our employees, we can focus on the content-oriented types of theories, such as the ones we get from Maslow and McGregor and McClellan and Herzberg, or we can focus on the process-oriented types of theories, such as Vroom's expectancy theory, operant conditioning, social learning theory, and Locke's goal-setting theory. And so those are just 8 different motivation theories that are very prominent in the public administration literature. But what we have found in the literature is that there's no single theory that provides a conclusive explanation of motivation. What we do have agreement on is that there's no one-size-fits-all approach, and that we need to have separate theories to apply in different situations. As we said, it's very contingency-based. So the motivational theory that you use will depend upon your employee that you're dealing with. It will depend upon the leadership style of the leader. It will depend upon the culture of the organization. It will depend upon the range of resources and incentives that you have to use to motivate your employees. What the literature does call for, it calls for the creation of taxonomies, essentially different motivational types for different types of settings. And so where the literature is at now is for an organization, for instance, that has a very open organization culture, but has very limited resources and has little communication and little trust between leaders and employees, which motivational strategy would work best in that situation, as compared to an organization where there's good communication, where there's ample resources and incentives. And so it's kind of that creating that taxonomy of which motivational theory works in which given situation. But we do understand that what the motivational literature tells us, it is possible to motivate our employees. But again, there is no one-size-fits-all approach. There's no science of motivation that we can apply in every single situation. And one of the biggest constraints, one of the biggest limitations that we have in the public sector in motivating our employees is obviously the limitations we have on the incentives that we can provide to those employees. We know that we rely much more on intrinsic motivators as opposed to extrinsic motivators here in the public sector. We know that we have very limited ability to do pay for performance. We have very limited ability to use compensation as an incentive for our employees. And even if we could use compensation, we know that for the most part, public sector employees are more focused on intrinsic rewards as compared to extrinsic rewards. So because of all these different limitations, the basic assumption is that public sector employees tend to be less motivated than their private sector counterparts. There is some truth to that on whole, public sector employees tend to have lower motivation levels and engagement levels than private sector employees. However, the differences are relatively small, and the motivational level of public employees is still very high. And so just because they're a little bit lower than what we see in the private sector, it doesn't mean that there's a problem with motivation. Motivational levels of employees tend to be relatively high in both the public as well as the private sector. Go back and take a look at that federal employee engagement study. And for some of those motivational types of questions, you see agreement in the range of 87, 85%. An overwhelming majority of federal employees do seem to be motivated and very engaged with their jobs. And those those engagement levels, as I said, have been going up year after year after year. So even though public sector employees face constraints in terms of what types of motivators they can receive, they still tend to be relatively motivated, even though they're a little less motivated than their private sector counterparts. Well, speaking of these incentives and the limitation that we have on the types of incentives we can use to motivate public employees, Chester Barnard tells us that there are basically two different categories of incentives that can be provided to motivate employees. There are worker-specific incentives and non-specific incentives. According to Barnard, the worker-specific incentives are things such as material incentives, non-material incentives, and improved working conditions. So, a material incentive could be compensation. Non-material incentive could be recognition. And obviously we know what working conditions are. Those are worker specific in that they're incentives that are given to specific workers that may be different than are given to other workers. The non-worker specific incentives are things such as a freedom from hostility and comfortable customary practices that all employees benefit from and that all employees enjoy. So it's kind of more that people aren't afraid to come to work. They're not afraid to do their job. They feel that they're free from hostility on the part of their leaders and their managers. But that applies to the vast majority of employees. They're not worker type of specific incentives. Herb Simon tells us that there are different sets of incentives for employees as compared to employers. Simon says, I like saying that, Simon says that for employees, incentives are things such as money when it can be used, prestige, social relationships, kind of that feeling of belonging to a bigger group, promotional opportunities. Those are the types of incentives that will motivate employees. However, employers tend to be much more motivated by power and authority as opposed to prestige, social, and promotional types of opportunities. Very similar to what McClellan told us back in our content-based discussion. McClellan said that employees tend to be much more motivated by achievement. Employers tend to be much more motivated by power and authority. Anthony Downs, and I think you've been introduced to this before because I've seen a couple people talk about this in their Canvas essays, but Anthony Downs is another author who's very well known for what he calls his bureau ideologies, which fits in nicely here because it, again, reinforces the idea that the type of motivation used will depend upon the individual employee. And some motivators work better for some employees as opposed to other employees. So what Anthony Downs tells us is there are essentially different types of employees, what he calls bureau ideologies. And he identifies for us 5 different types of employees. And these 5 different types of employees are going to be motivated by different types of incentives. So the first category of employees he refers to as the climbers. Climbers are usually your younger employees who have not been in the organization very long. They're the employees who are motivated by the opportunity to promote. So they want to move up the organizational ladder. You motivate them by offering them those promotional opportunities. For climbers, when those promotional opportunities are not evident and when they are not being provided, then you run the risk of these climbers engaging in something known as jumping. And jumping is when they literally jump from one organization to another. The climbers are the ones who are much more likely to jump than your other types of employees. So they're motivated by promotional opportunities. They're motivated by the achievement motivator of McClellan. Your second type of employee is a conserver. Conserver are your more, we'll say, veteran employees in the organization. They're the ones who have been in the organization for a longer period of time. They're the ones who are not necessarily motivated by the opportunity to move up in the organization, but rather they're motivated by the perks that they have already acquired. So being in the organization for a while, they have acquired some perks of the job. So they may have a good parking spot. They may have a good title. They may have a good office location. Those are all the types of perks that they've accumulated. And so they are then motivated by the opportunity to hold on to all those benefits that they've already accumulated. So a promotional opportunity may not be as attractive to a conservator as it would be to a climber. What motivates the conservators is holding on to what they've already acquired. Then your third type of employee is what Downs refers to as a zealot. A zealot is someone who is very passionate about a specific issue. And so you can appeal to that individual, you can motivate that individual by appealing to that issue and to try to provide resources and support for the accomplishment of that issue. And by doing that, you then motivate that zealot. So a zealot may have one policy that they are very passionate about. They're very passionate about housing people who are homeless, or they're very passionate about medical care and healthcare for veterans. And so most of their efforts going to go toward trying to solve that problem. And you can motivate them by helping them solve that problem. Then your fourth type of employee is what Downs refers to as an advocate. An advocate is someone who is passionate about their unit or their department within the organization. So they are motivated by maximizing the budget of that unit or that department. And so if they get their budget requests and they request 10 new hires and they get those 10 new hires, that's what's going to motivate them because it benefits their department, it benefits their unit or their division. So that's how you motivate an advocate. And then your last type of employee is what Downs refers to as a statesman or a statesperson. A statesperson is someone who is in public service to benefit society. They kind of have this macro view of their role as a public administrator. And so if you can tie what you are asking them to do in the organization with how this benefits society as a whole, that's what's going to motivate a statesman, a statesperson. That they can see the macro view of how it benefits society, the kind of sociotropic, as sociologists call it, the sociotropic view of altruism benefiting society. That's how you're going to motivate that employee. So obviously the big so what question is what we've already said. What Downs does is Downs shows us the contextual nature of motivation, that it's going to take different types of incentives to motivate employees. And you can't just use a one-size-fits-all type of an approach. So let me go ahead. There we go. That takes us then to our breakout groups. But again, I'm very concerned because, for some reason, I don't know why, but this Zoom session and again, it was set up through the CSUN Zoom environment. So it's set up just like all the rest of our sessions. For some reason, it's not in the pro version. And so it's limiting to us to 45-minute sessions. And I don't know why it's doing that, but it is. So at this point, we would go into breakout groups and we'd look at your individual organizations and identify the motivational strategies used in your organizations. This is essentially the same exercise you're going to be doing for your next Canvas essay. I am loath to go into breakout groups because I'm afraid that once we go in, we'll be in there about 10 minutes and then the session will end and whatever work you've done in your breakout group will then end up being lost to history. So I hate to do that. So instead, what I would recommend is maybe we just don't do the breakout groups tonight. Let me ask you though, do you have any questions or any observations in our time left, however long that may be, on these motivational strategies, either the content-based theories or the process-based theories? Any questions at all on motivational theories?
I have a question, Professor. Is there research that we can look into for how effective each theory is or has been in the public sector?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of literature in public administration that builds off of McGregor and builds off of McClellan. There's a lot of literature out there that looks into that. In terms of which motivational theory typically works best, there is a big body of literature by people like James Perry and Ed Kellogg. I'll put those names into text chat.
Thank
James
you.
Perry and Ed Kellogg. what was his spell's name? Ed Kellogg, that looks at incentives and looks at which incentives tend to work better for different types of employees. And they've literally spent probably 20 years doing research on incentives for public sector employees. And those are the two authors I'd really point you toward. And they usually publish together, Perry and Kellogg. So good place to start.
Thank you so much.
Sure. Yeah, and what Perry and Kellogg, their conclusion they tend to come to is that the public sector is a lot different than the private sector, and that most of the motivators in the public sector that work are the more intrinsic types of motivators, the motivators in terms of recognition and achievement, as opposed to any type of extrinsic type of measure. And that's usually the conclusion they arrive at. They're also really good at doing what we call meta-analysis. I don't know if you've done a meta-analysis before, but they do a lot of meta-analyses where they will take a lot of different databases, they'll combine them together, they'll then apply multiple regression to that combined database, and that's how they arrive at their conclusions. So, and Ed Kellogg and I had the same dissertation chair, actually, in grad school. He was about 10 or 15 years ahead of me. And so every time I would turn in a chapter of my dissertation, he was always the standard that I was held to. And my dissertation chair would say, well, Ed Kellogg wouldn't have done it that way. So, so I've always lived in the shadow of Ed Kellogg. He's been at the University of Georgia for probably about 25 years now. Cesar, go ahead.
Yeah, Professor, I have a question in general for motivation in public administration. I work in the private sector, and I work in a sales environment where motivation starts in the moment that you go inside the building until the moment that you leave, because it's a motivation, it's a sales environment where people make money based on commissions and so on, right? And that's the reason that why many people work over there, it's just to make commission. Now, other than that, because I know my company very well, but other than the sales environment, of course, there are many other positions that they're not really, there's not really an incentive regarding money. So my question is, and it's just a flat hourly wage, right? Whatever people, whatever people makes. So my question is, it's not really a question. It's a statement. I mean, it's a reflection that I have, because I don't really see the difference between people in the private sector, at least in the industry where I work, other than sales, and the people work in the public sector, because at the end of the day, they all need to go to work, they all need to do their job, they all receive eventually corrective action if they don't do their job. So I don't really see the difference. So my question is, actually, yes, I had a question. So my question is, what will be the difference then that in the, and I ask this because I'm not part of the public administration, and probably one of my classmates may also answer this question, but what will be the difference then that the motivation in the public administration is not as strong as in the private sector when there is not commission or bonus involved, right? Mm-hmm. So any other customer service job that you just go to work and that's it. So what will be the difference then?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think one of the differences is that, even beyond pay, and beyond the idea of commission and getting, additional pay for performance, I think that the promotional opportunities are different between private sector and public sector, in that the promotional opportunities are more fluid in the private sector than the public sector. That, you're not going to necessarily get promoted for performance in the public sector unless you're getting reclassified. Oftentimes, if you want to be promoted to a higher level position in the pay grade and then get compensated more, that's going to be done through a classification study rather than just a manager or leader coming in and saying, we're going to promote you to a higher position. Oftentimes it's going to have to be done through classification. And with the reclassification study, the only way that position is going to get classified to a higher pay band or pay grade is if the nature, the composition of the job itself has changed. And so I think there are more limitations and constraints in terms of promotional opportunities in the public sector than perhaps as compared to the private sector. I know Diana is saying in text chat, rely heavily on emotional motivation. And I think that's true. And I know that in my program, I always, when I was department chair, I would review the applications. And when the applications would come in, those applications would always be accompanied with an essay in terms of, why do you want the MPA degree? Why do you want to work in the public sector? And oftentimes it was for that kind of macro level benefit society. It was that statesperson type of approach. And I want to make my community better. I want to enhance my community. And even if I'm getting paid less doing it in the public sector, I feel I can have a bigger impact working for this public organization as compared to a private corporation. So I do think there is kind of that emotional element and the kind of doing good for the public type of element that we see in the public sector. But there are some limitations in the public sector that you don't necessarily see over in the private sector. But that's not to say that private sector employees don't have an achievement motivation. That's not to say that they're always motivated by money. I mean, there are a lot of people who are motivated by doing a good job and to become, to self-actualize and become the best that they can be, just like someone in the public sector. Let's see, Vernal says, in public sector, hardworking employees and slackers receive the same recognition. That's what we saw in that employee engagement survey from the federal government. That's what the respondents were saying. They were saying it doesn't really matter that people who are performing poorly, they don't get any penalties. There are no repercussions for poor performance, and there aren't a whole lot of recognitions for good performance either. And I think that's one of the frustrations that I think a lot of public sector employees have, and certainly employees at the federal level, as expressed in that employee engagement survey. So I think that's very true. And Tasha agrees. I think that's a good observation, and it is frustrating. But again, in the public sector, it's sometimes difficult for us to measure performance and then to tie rewards to performance. And it's because of our position classification systems, it's because of our pay grades. And it makes it a little bit more difficult just because we have such regimented positions in the public sector as compared to corollary positions over in the private sector. Well, according to my little clock here, it tells me we have 7 minutes and 40 seconds left. So are there any other observations or comments or questions or anything about any of this information we covered tonight in our remaining 7 minutes and 30 seconds? Now, I'll see what I can figure out why this is happening. I'll check with IT because it's never happened to me, like I said, in all these years of teaching in Zoom. So I think there's some glitch in the system somewhere that it's, I don't know if the university didn't re-up its subscription with Zoom Pro. I don't know what it is, but I'll figure it out. It's a holiday, that's true. It's probably because it's a federal holiday, it's giving us problems, so. Okay, if there are no other observations or no other comments or questions, again, you're going to use this information then to do your next Canvas essay. What types of motivational theories do you see in your organization, and how do those theories contribute to or detract from the organization's effectiveness? And that will be your next Canvas essay. Then what we'll do next week, hopefully the system will be fixed. And what we'll do next week then is we'll deal with leadership and the relationship between leadership and effectiveness, knowing that you've talked about leadership before in the program, so we can dispense with it relatively quickly. A few words on organizational change in terms of changing our organizations to try and make them more effective. Then we'll do a wrap up of the class, answer any last second questions you may have about your chosen solution paper. And then that will be it for our live Zoom sessions. And then your chosen solution paper, I believe we have due on October 21st. And then we will be all done and the class will be over. Okay. All right. I apologize again. Yeah, go ahead.
Can we go over this final paper? I'm reading the syllabus and it says that we should revise the first 2 parts of our paper. What do you mean by that? If we have been getting essentially 100%, could you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. I think people have done a really nice job on those first 2 papers. And so I have had some comments on some of the papers where I've said, you might want to think about the practicality, how realistic the solution is. And, here are some reasons why it may not be that realistic. So there have been some of those comments on some papers. And if you got a comment like that, just think about that feedback and think about how you would revise that in order to make it more practical. For some of the papers, though, I have found that the solutions are all very practical and I have no issues with them. So if you don't have any feedback from me in terms of things to think about or change, then you don't have any changes you need to make. You can just resubmit them as they are.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Yeah, and then you can just literally, you can just, and you don't have to have transitions between the papers. You don't have to make this like, one big paper that flows. You can just literally put in the first two papers with any revisions that have been recommended, and then add on your chosen solution part, and that's good enough, and that will get the job done. And then that chosen solution, I call it chosen solution singular, but it could be plural. You can use maybe say 2 of the 3 solutions can combine together into a hybrid approach. That's fine. You may have all 3 solutions you're combining together. You may be selecting one, whatever you find most appropriate for your organization.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Sure.
I have a
My
question.
pleasure. Yeah.
Are we to, so if I got like, for instance, 100 on both papers, I can just resubmit papers 1 and 2 and then resubmit papers number 3, the chosen?
Yeah, you can just resubmit 1 and 2, and then you'll write your new chosen solution paper with it, whatever alternative solution you're selecting. But yeah, if there are no revisions that are recommended, there's no revisions to make.
Oh, great. So I can just keep them separate. Wonderful.
Yep.
Thank you.
Sure.
So
Go ahead.
how long does the paper have to be the last? Because I was reading the syllabus and it says no longer than 20 pages. So if you're just
Yeah, the chosen solution paper can be the section can be very short. I mean, if you're just selecting one solution, just justify why you think it's most appropriate. That can be very short. You can probably handle that in a handful of pages, maybe 2 or 3 pages. And then, when you add it all up, hopefully it doesn't come out to more than 20. If it does, the paper 1, 2, and then your chosen solution, if it adds up to more than 20, that's fine too. That's not an issue. So I know we're down to 2 minutes and 48 seconds, but we have some hands up. So let's see. Okay. What do we have here?
2-3 pages, something like that.
For the chosen solution, yeah. Evelyn, go ahead.
If one of our solutions from our 3 options, if you made comments to it, should we propose another solution to replace one that you didn't like?
No, not necessarily. You can modify the one. Usually the comment I would have would be, maybe it's not realistic because it's going to cost extra money, and maybe the money's not there to pay for it. Just consider that, and maybe there's a way in which you can make it a little bit less expensive, or there's another stream of revenue you can find to pay for it. But you don't have to throw it out. Just think about how to make it more realistic. I think would probably be the way to revise it.
Thank you.
Mhm. Okay, we have 1:44, so time for a last second question.
So Professor, the extension will be probably what, about 2-3 pages, something like that.
For the chosen solution paper, that section, yeah, usually 2-3 pages probably is enough to get it done.
You want all your pages to add up to almost 20 pages, Caesar.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, I'm over that. Believe me. Already.
Yeah, that's fine. You can go over it.
Okay.
You're done.
Yeah, you're finished. You're done a week early, so there you go.
You're expecting some justification why we didn't pick up the other solution, or just focus on the one that we choose?
Yeah, usually it's a good strategy to say, you're picking this one. This is why you're picking this one over the other 2. Yeah, that's usually a good way to justify it.
Okay.
I have a question. Are we supposed to add these motivational models to our chosen paper number 3?
Only if appropriate. Yeah, you don't try and fit anything in. If it's appropriate, add it in. If it's not appropriate, you don't have to include it.
Got it.
Mhm.
Thank you.
Good. Okay, well, we brought it in on time. That we have 20 seconds left, so look at that. If you have any other questions as you're working on the chosen solution paper, shoot me an email because we're running out of time tonight. But send me an email. I'm happy to answer any questions you have, and then we can also cover it again next week when we get together in our last Zoom session. Sound good?
Isn't it due next week?
It's due on the 21st. Yeah, so you'll have next week's class on the 17th. We can cover any last minute questions. Then it's due on the 21st.
Wonderful.
Mhm.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Professor.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll have
Thank
this
you.
fixed next week, hopefully. So take care.